I heard the voice of Jesus say, "Come unto me and rest. Lay down thou weary one, lay down thy head upon my breast." I came to Jesus as I was, weary and worn and sad. I found in him a resting place, and he has made me glad. I heard the voice of Jesus say, "Behold, I freely give the living water, thirsty one, stoop down and drink and live." I came to Jesus and I drank of that life-giving stream. My thirst was quenched, my soul revived, and now I live with him.
Hello, welcome to our Bible study. My name is Clint McElroy, and today we'll be in 1 Chronicles chapters 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. Hope to see you there. Masks will be available at the door for anyone who needs one. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. We'll also be meeting at 9 a.m. for classes, so please join us for those if you care to. You're welcome to join us in the auditorium to watch this class on the large screen there. We want to make sure everyone's aware we have these English Standard Version Bibles available from the World Bible School. If you'd care to have one, please contact our church office and we'll make arrangements to get you one. Our sick list is quite long, so please refer to our bulletin for more information. We're so very thankful that the Lord answers our prayers, and we always want to go to Him in prayer and give those thanks to Him. As is our custom, we want to remember the story of the two men on the road to Emmaus who were joined by a third man on the way. When they got to their destination, the third man revealed himself to have been Jesus the Christ, resurrected from the dead, and left their company promptly. They reflected on their time with him after he left and realized that there had been a burning in their hearts while he had been with them. It's that burning that they had in their hearts that we hope to kindle in our own hearts as we draw closer to the Lord through a study of His Word. We also want to remember the admonitions of Leviticus chapter 19, to be holy for the Lord our God is holy. And we want to remember the story of Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and the prophet that came to Jeroboam. Rehoboam's is a sad story of a divided kingdom that occurred because of the sins of Solomon, his father. When Rehoboam took the reins of the country, the whole country, he listened to the advice of young, inexperienced advisors instead of listening to the older, more experienced advisors about matters pertaining to the happiness of the people in the kingdom. This, of course, led to the split of the northern tribes away from Judah, which he continued to rule, but the northern tribes were then subsequently led by Jeroboam. Jeroboam had been promised this by God while Solomon was still on the throne, and he chose to live in exile in Egypt until the time of Solomon's death. When he returned, he began ruling the northern tribes as Israel. Instead of following the instruction of the Lord, he chose instead to build high places in the mountains and told the people that they should worship God there rather than go into Jerusalem and worship God at the temple as would have been appropriate. He built not only these high places, but also golden calves, and told the people that these were the God that led them out of Egypt. He also set up a false priesthood to facilitate the worship in these high places. This was an abomination before the Lord from the time of Jeroboam until the time of Christ. God didn't just let Jeroboam do this. He sent a prophet from Judah to tell him that he was doing wrong, but Jeroboam didn't stop what he was doing. As the prophet left Jeroboam's presence, he was met in the way by another prophet, one from Israel, who had heard of this prophet and what he had done with the king, and wanted the honor of his company, and told him a lie, that he should come to this man and invite him to meal with him. The first prophet believed this lie and went to have this meal with this second prophet. No sooner had he sat down to meal with him than he heard the judgment of God come from the prophet from Israel, that he had done inappropriate things and his life would be forfeit because of it. As he got up to go home from that meal, he was met in the way by a lion and killed. It's a terrible story about God's expectations towards those he's given instruction to. We should understand when God's told us to do something, anything else that we're told is a message from the Lord should be in accord with God's message, or it is not a message from the Lord. We look at it as a kind of injustice that the man believed a falsehood and the person who brought that lie to him should be held responsible. And in fact, that may be the case, but the story is that he was held responsible because he believed the lie, just as the people of Israel believed the lie of Jeroboam and chose to worship God in the high places in those mountains rather than continue to go to Jerusalem to worship God as would be appropriate. This was the message that God was sending the people. This is the message we should be hearing today. He's given us instruction. He's told us what we should do, and it's up to us to do that or not to do it. So we look to the Lord's instruction. We look to His Word to find out what it is. We should know from His Word to recognize the truth when we hear it presented in a message, and to recognize a lie when we hear it presented in a message. We also know from the Lord's Word what we should do about those things, the way we should behave ourselves before the Lord. So I hope you will join me now as we enter into this study, that you will find some encouragement in these last words about the life of David as recorded in 1 Chronicles, and that you will benefit from them. A brief word about how we'll approach the study today. There are several chapters here we'll be looking at. We won't read them all. I'm going to read a short passage out of chapter 23, and then we'll start our discussion about the review from last week and continue on into the materials in chapters 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27. We, of course, will pass over these quickly. Most of it is names, but we want to look at why the names are recorded here and what purpose these things serve. So bear with me now as I begin this study in chapter 23 from the English Standard Version. When David was old and full of days, he made Solomon his son king over Israel. David assembled all the leaders of Israel and the priests and the Levites. The Levites, 30 years old and upward, were numbered, and the total was 38,000 men. 24,000 of these, David said, shall have charge of the work in the house of the Lord. 6,000 shall be officers and judges, 4,000 gatekeepers, and 4,000 shall offer praises to the Lord with the instruments that I have made for praise. And David organized them in divisions corresponding to the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And we'll stop there and go back now and look at chapter 22. The very beginning of chapter 22 is a verse that really goes with the end of the story as recorded in chapter 21. It says, Then David said, Here shall be the house of the Lord God, and here the altar of burnt offering for Israel. So we have established here that David bought this piece of land from Ornan the Jebusite as recorded in 1 Chronicles, and he has a different name in 2 Samuel. And that he dedicated this land for the purpose of the construction of the temple after he offered the offerings as recorded at the end of chapter 21. Going on into chapter 22, verse 2, David commanded to gather together the resident aliens who were in the land of Israel, and he set stonecutters to prepare dressed stones for building the house of God. David also provided great quantities of iron and other materials that's recorded here. So we start with the preparations David made for the temple construction. David understood from God that he could not build the temple, but God did not say that he could not prepare for the construction of the temple. So now he has a place to build the temple, and he needs to gather the materials for the construction to begin. He also prepared people to behave in such a way as to get those materials prepared for construction. This was quite a logistical accomplishment. It can't have been easy to gather all these materials and do so in such a way that would have been pleasing to God, but David found a way. David said in verse 5, For David said, Solomon my son is young and inexperienced, and the house that is to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent, of fame and glory throughout all lands. I will therefore make preparation for it. And indeed, when the temple was completed, it was an amazing thing, certainly a wonder of the ancient times. We don't know exactly how it looked. We know about how it looked based on the descriptions, but it was a sight to behold, certainly amazing, an amazing thing to see. Having done this, he called for Solomon in verse 6 and charged him, it says in verse 6, to build a house for the Lord, the God of Israel. David said to Solomon, "My son, I had it in my heart to build a house to the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, You have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name, because you have shed so much blood before me on the earth. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest. I will give him rest from all his surrounding enemies. For his name shall be Solomon, and I will give peace and quiet to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name. He shall be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish his royal throne in Israel forever." This is an incredible prophecy about Solomon. It's not clear when it was given, but apparently Solomon had not yet been born. But David had been instructed by the Lord that he was not to build the temple because he had done so much bloodshed in his life. Now, David makes the excuse that this was during wars, but we certainly know that his experience with Bathsheba was one that was murderous in nature, and I expect that was as much a part of this decision by God as any other thing. David continues in verse 11, "Now, my son, the Lord be with you, so that you may succeed in building the house of the Lord your God, as he has spoken concerning you. Only may the Lord grant you discretion and understanding, that when he gives you charge over Israel, you may keep the law of the Lord your God. Then you will prosper if you are careful to observe the statutes and the rules that the Lord commanded Moses for Israel. Be strong and courageous. Fear not, do not be dismayed. With great pains I have provided for the house of the Lord." And he again describes the materials that he's already amassed by the time he talks to Solomon here, which were quite considerable. He continues, "To these you must add, you have an abundance of workmen, stonecutters, masons, carpenters, and all kinds of craftsmen without number, skilled in working gold, silver, bronze, and iron. Arise and work, the Lord be with you." So this was his charge to Solomon. He continues in verse 17 and 18, commanding the leaders of Israel to help Solomon. In verse 17, "Is not the Lord your God with you? And has he not given you peace on every side? For he has delivered the inhabitants of the land into my hand, and the land is subdued before the Lord and his people. Now set your mind and heart to seek the Lord your God. Arise and build the sanctuary of the Lord God, so that the ark of the covenant of the Lord and the holy vessels of God may be brought into a house built for the name of the Lord." So he's given them charge. He expects them to continue this forth under the direction of Solomon as king. Now, Solomon was made king here before David's death. He would again be affirmed as David's successor. So we have maybe in David's mind a shortcut for getting started. I don't think any actual construction on the temple proper began until his death. But we see certainly David was giving orders and making charges to the people involved who would be carrying out this construction before he had passed. I think this is why we see at the beginning of chapter 23 that David makes Solomon his son king over Israel before his days were complete. So David made Solomon the successor. Of course, we see this later to be part of yet another minor rebellion among the sons of David. But Solomon takes over the throne at this point on a technicality. David is still alive, and so he still had expectations that these orders that he set forth in chapter 22 would be followed as Solomon was made king over Israel here. But we see later on, after David's death, that Solomon was affirmed as king yet again. So yeah, that's at the end of chapter 29. Solomon is affirmed a second time as king over Israel in chapter 29, verse 22. So anyway, that said, we see David is not done in his activities. Even though Solomon has been made king over Israel, David sets in order the leaders of the families of the Levites as leaders of the priesthood. So chapters 23 and 24 are very tedious to read and hard to understand, but basically he's going over both the genealogies of the families of the Levites and who was currently in charge of them, and who and what responsibilities were going to be meted out to the various people here. And I believe this is in accord with the charge that he's given in chapter 23, verse 4, of the numbers of men who would be in charge of the various activities. So we see these activities of the temple have to be carried out just as they had been carried out in the tabernacle, but the other responsibilities of the government and the keeping of the temple would be handled by these men as designated in verse 4 and 5 of chapter 23. Many of these were handed out by lot, so we see that this was an activity that was practiced here throughout these chapters for assigning job duties to the various families and heads of the families. These were all selected in these various ways. The roles and responsibilities and the actions of all the individuals I'm not going to get into because they are long and tedious. Going on into chapter 25, the roles of the musicians and the praise people are being designated. And again, he designated 6,000 as officers and judges from verse 4 of chapter 23, 4,000 as gatekeepers in verse 5, and 4,000 as those who would offer praises to the Lord with instruments. So this was the role that he's filling in chapter 25. Of note to me, anyway, are the names that immediately come up, Asaph and Heman. Both of these names we see frequently throughout the Psalms, as footnoted there. Different songs were either written by or instrumentals were made for the songs by these men. These different roles that they played are clearly shown in the Psalms. So if you ever look at those footnotes, and it's fun to do from time to time, you'll see that these names are part of the names that are given there. And there is a long list here of the different names of the different people. And as an example, in verse 8 of chapter 25, they cast lots for their duties, small and great, teacher and pupil alike. The first lot in verse 9 fell for Asaph to Joseph, and the second to Gedaliah, to him and his brothers and his sons 12. So these are the kinds of things that you would read throughout all this passage, along with tongue twister names that I'm quite exhausted at reading. It's just hard to look at them and read them, let alone try to pronounce them. But the names here are interesting and they're relevant. If you go through other passages of Scripture, you will see references to some of these names. So it's not without merit to read through here, of course. They're here for a reason, and there are things that can be served from a study of them. Going on into the divisions of the gatekeepers are likewise selected by lot, and the roles are designated here with some specificity. So there's no lack again here of names that are hard to pronounce, but again, it's worth noting because some of these names again come up in different activities later on. The genealogies are important in later passages in the Bible, and they're all rooted here in these passages as the roles that are played by different families are designated here. Just a short passage out of the last part of the gatekeeper designation, starting in verse 17 of chapter 26. On the east side, there were 6 each day. On the north, 4 each day. on the south floor each day, as well as 2 and 2 at the gatehouse. And for the colonnade on the west side, there were 4 at the road and 2 at the colonnade. These were the divisions of the gatekeepers among the Korathites and the sons of Merari. So here we have just a role that was played by some of these men designated here, and a description of components of the temple that are interesting, that there were the colonnades here on the west side and toward the road, that there were certain numbers of gatekeepers that were to be present from these families at all times. Going on at the end of chapter 26, we see other officials of the administration designated and spoken of as treasurers in the house to begin with, and going forth through other roles. I believe more than just treasurers are spoken of here. But there certainly were a lot of people who were responsible for different amounts of money. I did note that there is a name here in verse 31, Hebronites, that I found interesting. I don't know if this may be tied to the name Hebrew or rooted in the name Hebrew, but I do find it interesting. It could be that these men were from Hebron, but the name here stands out as an interesting point of consideration for me anyway. And then the way that it ends of chapter 26 ends is interesting, because it says King David appointed him, meaning this person who was a Hebronite, to be one of 2,700 men of ability, heads of the fathers' houses, to have oversight over the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manassites, for everything pertaining to God and for the affairs of the king. So this has something to do with external duties, not necessarily treasury related. Just an interesting chapter to look over. Again, aside from the names, which makes it quite difficult to read, there are some interesting roles here described for the people involved. In chapter 27, we see the military divisions described, those who would be in charge of various concerns of the military, that there were 24,000 men of each division, and there were 12 divisions, according to verse 15. After that, there are other descriptions of other men, including Jaziel, the son of Abner, for the house of Benjamin, as being people who would be over the different tribes of Israel. That's in verse 21. Then we see that these were the leaders, and in verse 22 of chapter 27, we see that these were the leaders of the tribes of Israel. David did not count those below 20 years of age, for the Lord had promised to make Israel as many as the stars of heaven. Joab the son of Zeruiah began to count, but did not finish. Yet wrath came upon Israel for this, and the numbering was not entered in the Chronicles of the King David. So I did mention earlier that the differences between the story of the census are different between the recounting in 2 Samuel and the accounting in 1 Chronicles. The numbers are different. Some of the details of the story are different. One of those details is that Joab did not count the Levites and the Benjaminites, I think. He did not do that, and this may be a footnote to that here recorded in chapter 27, that Joab began to count these men, but did not finish that count and did not enter it into the Chronicles of King David. This is a very interesting verse to me out of most all of these verses in these 5 chapters, because it speaks to the preceding story, and it speaks to this kind of bureaucratic footnote. It's a kind of a bureaucratic footnote to the way they recorded the information that's in this book that we have. This is very interesting to me. Probably not of any interest to anybody else, but I find that a very interesting thing. Then it lists out some more people through of David's administration, including these men at the very end of chapter 27. It says Ahithophel was the king's counselor, and Hushai the Archite was the king's friend. Ahithophel was succeeded by Jehoiada, the son of Benaiah, and Abiathar. Joab was commander of the king's army. So we know that Ahithophel again killed himself because of the rebellion, and this is one of the few mentions of anything about that in First Chronicles. So we don't have a lot of information about any of the rebellions against David recorded in First Chronicles, but here Ahithophel is called out and his successor is called out. So these are the things that are recorded here in chapters 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27. A lot of kind of bureaucratic information, a lot of detailed information about how the order of behavior would be for the Levites going forward. This was going to be a change from the way things were handled by default with the tabernacle. Now these roles would be shared among even greater numbers of people, and there were more roles, but there were still more people than there were roles to fill. So there were a limited number of people given responsibilities over each thing. And this all comes into play later when you read about the different family divisions of the Levites, including John the Baptist, as Scott's been bringing out in his study of John the Baptist over the past few weeks on Wednesday nights. This is all very interesting information if you like to look at genealogies. If you don't, it's got a few interesting things in here that are of note. I hope I've been able to bring out some of that they relied so heavily on lots was their way of letting God select those who were appropriate for each role that was to be played. This was their way of letting God speak. This may have some bearing on our behavior as well. I don't know. We'll let that go for another day of study. I hope you found a word of encouragement in today's material. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. Hope to see you there. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. God bless. Have a great week.